Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our second piece on this topic of can machines think? So today we're taking a look at John Searle and his paper Minds, Brains, and Programs, in which he proposes his fairly famous Chinese room thought experiment, as he calls it. The paper is back from the 1980s. I think it's, well, yeah, it's 1980 itself, so 40 years old at this point. Become rather sort of stock and trade in philosophy of mind. Like Putnam worked in philosophy of mind and language, as well as in some other areas. This is probably his best known piece and thought experiment. He was a professor at University of California, Berkeley for a number of years, and he was a professor emeritus there until just last year, actually, 2019, when he was stripped of that status after some different allegations. I believe a lawsuit came to light as well about effectively sexual impropriety. I'll just put it that way. And so there's an interesting question here on our hands. And in our next film, our last film, of course, actually, Moon, also has Kevin Spacey voicing a character. So between Searle and Spacey, here we have two men of position and influence who have been accused of effectively sexual impropriety over a number of years, and who have both suffered some form of consequences for it. So Searle has had his emeritus status stripped, and in fact, I went and looked at the Berkeley philosophy page, and I don't see him listed there anywhere. So there seems to be no acknowledgement anymore about his previous affiliation with the institution. And of course, Spacey has been, to my knowledge, effectively blackballed from acting at this point. Now, there's an interesting question here, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I want to, raise and acknowledge that it's an interesting question, something that I thought about in this course. In my mind, there's certainly no question about whether or not, assuming Searle and Spacey really did do the things that have been alleged, which I have no reason to think they weren't, or that they didn't happen, certainly should suffer consequences as a result of that, and they both are, at least to some extent. Good question if they're suffering enough consequences of their actions. I'm not really going to speculate on that. I think that's a big and interesting question. But the question that I think concerns us here most, and I think certainly me, is whether or not we should continue to engage with works of people who have done bad things. So taking Searle here, should we be reading the Searle paper if in fact he's done these things and been inappropriate and so on? I find that a tough question to answer, I'll be perfectly honest. And if you've got thoughts on this matter and you want to email me about it and have a little bit of a conversation, share your views, by all means, I'm perfectly open to that. I am, at least currently, of the mind that, say, reading the Searle paper, as I was saying before with Putnam, and I've mentioned sometimes with other people, the reasons and arguments we give are separate from the people who give them. It could very well have been the case that somebody other than John Searle, with no sort of morally or legally dubious acts conducted, could have produced the same argument. And it still would have been a good argument. It still would have been an interesting argument. So, at least in my view, we can take the argument and the reasons as something separable in some sense from Searle himself. And so, just because on the one hand Searle has done bad things doesn't mean we should completely ignore what he's written, particularly because what he's written has been influential. Now, that's not the same thing as to just sort of run it together and say, well, because he did this influential philosophy work, he gets a free pass or something like that. I don't think that's right. I think Berkeley has acted correctly in stripping him of the status. If there are legal ramifications and other ramifications for his actions, he should suffer those as well. But I don't think it's the case that we should just pretend like what he's written doesn't exist, and that this influential work, just didn't exist. I think if we apply that same principle looking back at other actors in history, so this is somewhat topical with taking down statues and things like that. We don't need to have a kind of singular judgment on that person. I think, right? We can judge somebody's actions, their moral character, and so on in one way, but still, on the other hand, recognize other contributions they've made. So just looking at historical actors, just sort of generally, we can recognize both the influence they had historically, the perhaps good things they did, while also recognizing the bad things they did, and not giving them a free pass, where it's not like, oh, well, because they did this good thing, it doesn't matter they did those bad things. Rather, I think we can take those and have, in some ways, I hesitate to put it this way, but sort of a morally ambiguous view, right? Is Searle a good person or not? Or are these historical actors good people or not? Should we admire them or not? And I think issues about statues and glorification and something like having an emeritus status as a professor is a kind of, I think this is a bit of an overstatement, but a kind of glorification. As I've mentioned before when I was talking about the emeritus status, it's a way of an institution maintaining a link with somebody who used to be there. It's a kind of honorary title. It's a kind of recognition. Sometimes it comes with certain benefits like lab space or workspace or something like that. So in some ways what Berkeley did was take down Searle's statue, right? They said, look, you've been very influential and you're here for a long time and everything, but we're not going to glorify that anymore. We're not going to celebrate that linkage given what's come to light. Is asking you to read the Searle paper and talking about the Searle paper a way of glorifying them? Arguably, yes, right? And I could see that side of the argument. Somebody saying, well, why don't we look at something else, right? Someone else, the writing of some different person. Perhaps part of the reason I've chosen the Searle paper and stuck with the Searle paper here, I've used it in the past. I've known about this paper for a long time. I've talked about it for a while. Before any of these allegations came to light, or at least before I was aware of any of them, which I'm not saying that sort of gives me a free pass, morally speaking, but I think it certainly does matter, right? I'm not aware of any other paper of sort of a nice, succinct length that sort of makes the same points and fits the topic and what we're doing quite as well. Hence why I chose to stick with it, as well as the fact the separability that I was talking about. Even though Searle's the one who wrote it, I think we can take the reasons and the argument as something different. Did I do the right thing? I don't know. And this is why I'm open and interested to hear your thoughts if you have any. I think at this point I'll just sort of move into the topic after this perhaps slightly meandering exploration of the issue and my reasoning. But I wanted to share it because I want to recognize that it is an issue that needs to be decided one way or another. Not in the sense of sort of finally and for all purposes and, we just need to make a decision to get on with it. I'm not saying that. But for the purposes of this course, I had to make a decision. Am I going to keep Searle in or not? I decided yes. But I wanted to share with you the reasons why I did that, as well as acknowledge that there are reasons to the contrary. But I found in this case that sort of all things considered, when I reflected on it, was worth keeping the piece in here, but while also acknowledging the fact that I made this sort of decision rather than just sweeping it under the rug, because I could have easily just not mentioned this. And, unless you did some internet searching or something and looked up Searle, you probably would have been none the wiser, presumably. Right? So, all right, I think I'll go ahead and leave it there. Like I said, I'm very open to thoughts, comments, arguments if you have them on either side. If you think, yeah, what I said here makes sense and this, keeping it in is a sensible decision. Or on the other hand, if you think, really, no, I shouldn't do this and I should really, get Searle out of here. I should, say, take out Moon because Kevin Spacey voices a character in it. Please share your reasons. I'm very open to reconsidering my position if I see strong enough reasons that sort of incline me that way. So feel free to share if you've got a good argument on your hands. Okay, so into the paper itself, mind, brains, and programs. So here again, I've broken it down to 3 parts. So first, the basic argument that a computer program, no computer program can understand anything. Effectively, this is what Searle wants to argue for. So he's going to distinguish between strong and weak artificial intelligence. And effectively, what he's arguing against is strong artificial intelligence here. We're going to have to qualify exactly how this first point works, because Searle comes out and says basically the opposite of this. In fact, he says, oh, sure, computer programs can think if you understand them in a certain kind of way. So we're going to have to make sense of this. Proposes this Chinese room thought experiment that he's really famous for, and that really forms the core of the paper. It's supposed to be a kind of counterexample to the possibility of strong artificial intelligence. And then he considers, raises, and responds to 6 different objections to the Chinese room thought experiment that other people have actually raised in different presentations he's given, and then he offers his responses to those. So we're going to see that. So in this case, not only is there 1 objection being raised and responded to, but in fact 6. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So first, this distinction between weak artificial intelligence and strong artificial intelligence. So the weak AI theory, the way Searle is talking about it, and he's trying to engage with, at this point, 1980 and leading up to that, people working in computing and the development of programs and artificial intelligence and so on. So like Putnam, he's working on these sorts of things in some sense, in early days when computers were much less capable than they are now. So the weak AI approach sees computers as very powerful tools we can use in the study of the mind as well as in other areas. So on the weak AI view, computers are just this really great tool we have for trying to explore psychology and different factors surrounding the mind, connections between mind and brain, and so on. Now, strong AI, on the other hand, and this is the view that Searle wants to oppose. This is the target of the Chinese room thought experiment. It's supposed to be a kind of counterexample of this. This theory holds that the computer is not merely a tool in the study of the mind, rather, the appropriately programmed computer really is a mind, in the sense that computers given the right programs can be literally said to understand and have other cognitive states. So thinking back to Putnam in some sense, the strong AI hypothesis, functionalism would support that if it has the right sorts of functions, right, a computer with the right kind of program and the right kind of input-output capabilities can literally be said to understand, to be in pain, Putnam's example, right, to like something, to say be creative, to have beliefs, and so on. Right? Now, Searle thinks that weak AI is quite fine. He's got no objection to that at all. The way he formulates the strong AI thesis a little bit later in the paper on page 422 is that mental processes are computational processes over formally defined elements. So there is, part of what's going on in this paper is some sort of technical jargon from philosophy of mind and computer science and things like this, especially from the time. So there are going to be a few things in the paper that are sort of a little tricky to navigate and really fully make sense of. And in fact, if you read beyond the, just what I asked you to read up to 424, where he considers those objections and replies, there's a series of responses and comments on Searle's paper. And one of those, I can't quite remember who it was off the top of my head, they themselves state that, in fact, many people, the great majority of people don't fully understand what a lot of this language and what a lot of this terminology really actually means. So don't feel bad if you sort of go through and there are parts of this where it's just sort of like, oh boy, what exactly does that mean? Hopefully I'll give you at least if the writing of it posed some barrier for understanding. Hopefully it'll make sense of it enough that you can see what's going on for our purposes. So in talking about strong AI, Searle talks particularly about Roger Schenck and his colleagues at Yale, who worked on programming a computer to answer questions about stories that it read. So the questions had answers that were not directly answered by the stories. So he gives the example about, there's a couple different stories about a man who goes to a restaurant, orders a hamburger. One version of the story came out burnt to a crisp. He didn't pay for the meal. He didn't leave a tip, right? He left very upset. And then the question that the computer had to answer is, did the man eat the hamburger? Whether or not he ate the hamburger isn't part of the story. But what Schenck and his colleagues were trying to do is program a computer to have the right kind of information, the right kind of program that the computer would understand, in some sense, enough about human behavior, about restaurants, about hamburgers, and so on, that based on the information it was given, it could make the inference, which to us seems pretty obvious, that the man didn't eat the hamburger, when it was burned to a crisp. Now, of course, when I hear that story and I look at it, I say, well, was he really cheap? Because he could have eaten the hamburger and then complained a whole bunch and then left without paying. But perhaps that's a non-obvious answer. Maybe I'm being the weird one here. On the other hand, another version of the story, man orders the hamburger. It was very well done. He left a very big tip and, said lots of nice things and left the restaurant very happy. Did he eat the hamburger? Yes, right? And so this is what they're trying to get the computer to do, Schenck and his colleagues. So strong AI, Searle thinks, contains two claims about computers answering questions about the story it reads. They are that the machine can literally be said to understand the story and provide the answers to the questions. And second, that while the machine and its program, that what the machine and its program do explains the human ability to understand the story and answer questions about it. That really, the computer, with that particular program, quite literally understands the story and is really answering questions, and that its ability to do that really explains our own ability to do it. That really humans are just doing the same thing as the computer. This is what Searle does not think is correct. This is what he wants to object to. So he wants to ultimately argue that computer programs can't think, at least when we understand them in a certain way, and he rejects strong artificial intelligence. Now, this is where I said, Searle almost says the exact opposite of what I'm saying he says here. So I want to deal with that first so we can sort of move on. He does, in several places, make claims that sound sort of opposite to what I'm attributing to him, because he says that almost everything, including human thought and behavior, can be considered a computer program or program in some sense. Why? Well, this is really because everything follows some set of rules, and a computer program can simulate something following that set of rules. Right? This really, I think, is what Searle is getting at. Right? If we look at human thought and behavior as following some kind of set of rules, and we look at computers as things that can be programmed to simulate, right, that run according to a set of rules, and that can run simulations or representations, right, can run programs of things following certain sets of rules, and we can get in there and tweak what those rules are exactly, then of course we could look at humans as sort of running a program, so to speak, or being a certain kind of computer or a certain kind of machine. So in that sense, right, Searle will sort of say the opposite. Insofar as humans are machines of a certain sort, biological machines that run, follow certain sorts of rules, run certain sorts of programs, have certain input-output functions, then sure, machines can think. And in fact, if you look right near the end of the piece and he goes through this little sort of question-answer sequence, this is where he sounds closest in some sense, I think, to saying the opposite of what I say he is saying. But this is really what he's getting at, that we can look at humans and other animals and really anything as a kind of machine that follows rules of some sort. Right? He adopts the mechanistic paradigm here, which in some ways a lot of modern science does. right? Looks at organisms, looks at really any kind of process as something that's following some kind of set of rules that we could, at least in principle, understand, right? And then sort of toy around with the way things work by seeing how the rules apply and then determining what we're going to do about that. So sure, humans viewed as a kind of biological machine, right, that run a certain kind of program, follow a set of rules, think, right? And Searle thinks it's obvious, right, that humans think and understand and feel and so on. But then the question is, can a computer, right, a digital computer, right, like what I'm recording this video on, Chappie, right? Can something like that really be said to think or feel or whatnot based on the program? And this is exactly what Searle wants to deny, right? It's not the case that something like a computer can think or understand solely in virtue of being a computer with the right sort of program. So it's not just about having the right kind of program. It's not just about having the right set of rules, but Searle thinks you have to be made of the right kind of stuff, right? And so it's not just the formal element, right? The form or shape that it takes. That might sound weird and obscure, but I'll try to clarify in a second. But rather, what's running the program? What's the thing actually following the rules that matters? So I'm talking about the form or the shape. When you think about just like a normal computer, right? Like just any old computer. There you have a chunk of hardware, and there's a hard drive and a processor, and there's going to be RAM and storage and, well, and a motherboard and power supply and all the different parts of it, right? But different computers will operate differently in the sense of if you've got different programs on them, they can do different things. So my computer here that I'm recording this on is set up in such a way that I can record video on it. It's got that capability. I've got Microsoft PowerPoint. That's what I'm using to run the slides here. I'm using Zoom to actually record this video. But other computers might not have Zoom on it or PowerPoint, or might not be set up to deal with a USB camera the way mine is, or might have all sorts of programs that it lacks. In principle, it might be able to run them that way, but it isn't actually running them. So for a computer to actually do something in particular, there has to be the appropriate hardware there. It has to be made up in a certain kind of way. It has to be made of certain stuff. And those have to be put together, and there's the energy running through there. And then there also needs to be certain software, which is governing the behavior of the physical components of the thing, right? What Searle wants to reject is that you could make a computer like my computer here, or a robot like Chappie, actually think or understand or feel or be conscious by running the right kind of program. So if we think about the context of Chappie for a second, Chappie is just one of those security police droids, one of the scouts. Now the rest of the scouts we don't regard as thinking. And certainly Dion and the rest of them don't regard as thinking, because they run a far more basic kind of program, right? They have input-output functions. They're sophisticated in their own way, right? They are still complex by at least today's standards. But they don't learn like Chappie does. They don't develop. They don't seem capable of developing independent personalities, right? They are strictly governed by orders they're given and commands they're given, right? They do the things they're supposed to, they don't do the things they're not supposed to, and that's it. They don't really have power of choice, whereas it seems like Chappie does, at least to some extent. So what we get in Chappie is that Chappie himself, if he in fact is conscious, he becomes conscious precisely because he's running a different sort of program from the other scouts, right? That AI program that Dion develops and then uploads into it and then lets run over time. Right? This is exactly what Searle wants to deny, that a machine, a computer, could become conscious solely in virtue of being a computer with the right sort of program, right? That on Searle's view, there has to be a change in what it's made of to be conscious. Or I suppose, rather, I'll put it a different way. The only things that can be conscious, the only things that can think, are ones that are made up of the right kind of hardware, like what we have, right, humans. Something like Chappie, something like my desktop computer are just not the right sorts of things that are capable of thought in the first place. Okay. And so just a little bit further on this note, ultimately Searle concludes, and this is where the language seems like it can pose a barrier and be confusing, right? He concludes that, and this is right near the end, this is 424, only a machine could think, right? And indeed only very special kinds of machines, namely brains and machines that had the same causal powers as brains. So, right, he regards human beings as kinds of machines. He regards our brains as kinds of machines. So you've got to keep that in mind as you're looking at the piece and trying to understand what he's saying, because if when you see the word machine, you think non-human, then you are going to be led into difficulties. All right. So one more section here before we get to the Chinese room thought experiment itself. Searle's view is that computer programs, right, rather like things that aren't human, so my computer, Chappie, the Scouts and so on, they merely engage in symbol manipulation. This is really what they do. Given certain symbol inputs, they give certain symbol outputs, but they aren't conscious, they aren't aware of what any of that means, right? They have no sense of meaning or intentionality. And those are the things that are really required for consciousness. So in his view, programs engage with and are really programmed to deal with syntax, right? The order of words and symbols. Given certain inputs, you give certain outputs. But they are not designed and they aren't capable of handling semantics, which really is a branch of linguistics concerned with the meaning of words and symbols. Right? Searle's view, you have to be able to grasp meaning to actually understand something, although you can simulate understanding, right? You can pretend to understand or behave like you understand based on the syntax. So look, just sticking with the syntax semantics distinction here, you might already be familiar with this distinction based on studying languages or linguistics in some sense. But really, syntax is how symbols are ordered and how they can be properly arranged so that they come after one another. Whereas semantics is really about how symbols relate to the world, generally speaking. So look, here's a sentence, a well-formed English sentence. Henry ate a banana for dinner after watching the sunset. Right? I just made it up. I don't know why. Henry ate a banana for dinner after watching the sunset. Right? Now, in this case, the semantics of the sentence are really concerned with how those different words or perhaps phrases connect to the world. So when you think about like Henry, okay, proper name for presumably man, right? Banana, we understand what a banana is, right? Ate, right? Past tense of eat, right? Henry eats the banana, right? He's eating it for dinner, right? That's what his dinner consists of. And he's eating it after he watched the sunset, right? So, those words, sunset, banana, ate, Henry, right? Dinner, the prepositions that connect them together, right? That's semantics, right? We're thinking about what do those words mean? Syntax is really the order of them, right? Henry ate a banana for dinner after watching the sunset makes sense, right? That's perfectly normal English sentence. A little unusual, but right, perfectly normal. But if we just rearrange the words, right, we violate the syntactical rules of proper sentence formation. We can have the exact same words and formulate them in a way that just is gibberish. So for instance, sunset banana Henry after ate watching the A4. All exactly the same words, different order, doesn't make any sense. So, but we can still look at it, we can think in semantic terms about, what sunset and banana and Henry and after and ate and watch and right, all that means, right? So we can do still some semantics work, but syntax is really how these things are ordered properly or not, right? And so what Searle's getting at is that a program, right, a computer program, what it's really designed to do and what it can do is see the order of the symbols, but it never really understands what they actually mean. So if you think about a word processor, for instance, right? I use Microsoft Word, and there's a grammar function in there. And sometimes if you get the word order wrong or you do something, it comes up with a kind of suggestion, says, oh, hey, consider reordering these words or, insert a comma here or whatever it is. Now, does the computer running Word understand what my sentence means? Searle says no, right? But it's been programmed in a way that it recognizes when there's certain strings of words, that there are certain sorts of rules to be followed, and that some ways of arranging those words or in certain punctuation and so on is following the rules correctly. Other ways aren't following those rules correctly. And of course, they're not always right. And when I think back to 20 years ago when I was using word processors, they were far less sophisticated than they are now. They couldn't do as much. There are other programs for things like grammar and so on, or even spelling, which are trying to look at the order of words and symbols and really thinking about how these things fit together. But even there, we don't think other programs that are checking that kind of thing really understand what it is that we're writing, right? They're just designed to examine how symbols fit together in certain ways, right, and respond to that. And when we think back to what I was talking about yesterday with functionalism and Putnam, even things like pressing the space on keyboard and going to the next slide or whatever, that's a program designed to take a certain input and respond with a certain kind of output. But that doesn't mean it's thinking. It doesn't mean it's conscious or understands anything or cares. It's just doing a certain kind of thing, right? Similarly, Searle says that, and this is actually a good spot to bring up this last point. Look, the light switch in my room, when I turn it on, the light comes on, I turn it off, the light goes off. Now, it hasn't really been programmed in a certain way, to be honest. If you know anything about how electricity gets wired in the house and how switches like that work, it's very basic, right? You sort of put the connection together and you separate the connection, you twist a bunch of wires together, and that's what all the all that fancy stuff runs on, a bunch of twisted wires that electricity runs through, right? We make it look fancy, and we put nice covers on the walls and switches and everything, but when it gets right down to it, it's a bunch of wire, run through a bunch of walls, and it's all just twisted together. That's how the outlets work. Right? You take the wire, you sort of twist it on the thing, and you screw it in, and that's it. And by the way, this is not some denigration of electricians or anything like that. I'm just saying that, the light switch, the way it operates, it's very basic, right? It's far simpler than what my computer does when I hit the space bar, because it can do so much more with the space bar. But this is Searle's point that, when it gets right down to it, sure, the computer, there are far more operations happening between me hitting space bar and then advancing to the next slide. But really, what are we looking at? Sort of input-output function. Well, that's what the light switch does, right? Hit the light one way, the light comes on. I hit another way, the light goes off. We don't think the light switch is thinking, right? It doesn't understand that I want the light on or the light off, right? It's not conscious. Thermostats don't think about what the temperature is, right? They go up and down based on what the heat's like, or if you've got something that detects humidity or something, right? Those gauges operate based on what the input's doing. They follow the rules that govern their behavior, right? Which might be actually the temperature and the expansion of fluids or whatever it is, exactly how it's designed. They follow those rules, they operate in a certain way. That doesn't mean they're thinking, right? They're not conscious. Why? Well, and this comes back to this syntax semantics distinction. Intentionality and grasping meaning are really causal products of brains that can't be duplicated by computer programs and things. So the ability to grasp meaning, right? The ability to have an understanding of semantics. This is the kind of thing Searle thinks that things like our brains, so human brains can do, the brains of other animals like us, other mammals and so on, just like other living organisms on Earth, says, right, insofar as that they're like us, they behave like us, they also seem to be put together biologically similar to us, right? Not exactly like us, but similar to us. That gives us pretty good reason to believe that they're thinking as well, right? Cats and dogs and aardvarks and whatever. But, right, can computers think? In Searle's view, they're really just not made about the right kind of stuff. Right? And he says, there might in fact be other beings, right, aliens and so on, that are made of different sorts of things than we are, right? They're put together different. They have a different kind of biological organization, and they might in fact be able to think. But that's going to be an empirical matter for us to discover. But so far as we can tell, there's really nothing about computers and the programs they run that shows us that they have the ability to grasp meaning or that they're really intentional. Now, intentionality is really the aboutness of something. So our mental states, our conscious states, are often regarded as being intentional. Now, not all of them, in the third footnote, I think it is, Searle talks about this, right? You know, if I desire to go get a cup of coffee, right, or I desire to take a drink of water, I had a desire for something, right? It was about something. Say I learn a piece of news and it makes me sad. I'm sad about that thing. Now, of course, we could just be sad, like, you know, you feel depressed or something, just in general, right? You might be really, you know, upset or something. Somebody says, oh, like, what's wrong? You're like, I don't even know, right? I'm just in a bad mood, or I feel depressed, or whatever it is. But I can't point to anything that it's about, right? It's that aboutness that's the intentionality, right? When I'm reading something, I'm thinking about it, right? When I desire something, my desire is, you know, about or for the thing. Computers just aren't that kind of thing, right? We can make them operate more and more complexly and have greater and greater input-output functions, and they can be more and more variable, right? They can have different sorts of probabilities. They can be very, very complicated. In fact, so complicated that it's hard, if not impossible, to predict what they're going to do next. But that doesn't mean that they're actually thinking things. Doesn't mean they're conscious, right? So thinking about Chappie and thinking about Vincent, right? Hugh Jackman's character. He regards Chappie as not a thinking thing, right? Chappie's not real in the sense of being a real person. That is an entity that actually is conscious, that thinks, that believes, that feels, right? That really has intentionality. Like, Chappie doesn't really mean to do anything. He doesn't really desire anything. He's not really afraid of anything. Rather, he's just going through pre-programmed reactions in some sense. And that's, you know, when Vincent says, look, you know, you've just got wires and stuff up here, right? Like, you're not real. That's what he's really getting at. Chappie's, you know, never, he's not fully intentional, right? His thoughts and beliefs and desires and so on aren't really ever about anything. He never really understands meaning. He just mimics things, right? He somehow simulates things. So when he seems sad, right, he's not actually sad with his behaviors being, you know, or frightened or in pain or, right, insert whatever the state is here. You know, for us humans, we're actually in those states, and our behaviors are a result of them, right? You get sad, you cry. You get angry, you yell, or whatever, right? But for Chappie, in Vincent's view, none of that's really going on the inside. It's not that Chappie's really actually sad. It's that based on a, you know, certain set of inputs, his programming is now dictating he should behave in sad ways, right? Which, even for him, he doesn't understand what sad is, right? He has no sense of the semantics. He just understands the syntax based on certain input functions, right? Given that this and this and this comes first, right? Then these other things should come after. And you can think about that syntax sort of being writ large as just the ordering of input-output functions, right? Given that you have this as a start, you can have that as the result. And in Vincent's view, that's really all Chappie's doing. That is also Searle's view. Now, one thing I want to note here is that Searle, right near the outside of his paper, in fact, like right in the abstract, notes a certain assumption that he makes. Hold on, one. And so if you go to the abstract, right at the start, he says that this article can be viewed in his attempt to explore the consequences of two propositions. One, intentionality in human beings and animals is a product of causal features of the brain. I assume this is an empirical fact about the actual causal relations between mental processes and brains. It says simply that certain brain processes are sufficient for intentionality. So that's really how he opens the piece. And now here, you know, we see that assumption coming in, and it seems to play this really key role in Searle's piece, right? And so I'm going to pose this to you, but I'm not going to explore it any further. Is Searle really just begging the question, that is he assuming the conclusion that he's trying to prove here by making that assumption in the first place, right? And seemingly a related assumption, which really in the next part, the second part is what he asserts. Is he really just assuming the conclusion he wants to be true here, or does the Chinese room thought experiment, which is what we're going to turn to right now, actually give us good reason to believe this conclusion? The machines can't really think, right? So let's take a look at that experiment, this sort of counterexample he has. So he says, suppose he's locked in a room, right? Or this could apply to anybody. It could be me, it could be you, it could be whoever. He knows no Chinese, as he puts it. I assume he means Mandarin. Right. Chinese isn't a language. Mandarin is a language. Cantonese is a language. There are several other sort of dialects, languages that are spoken in China and by people we might want to call Chinese. Mandarin is by far the most predominant. Presumably that's what he means. Whenever I see somebody talk about Chinese, I kind of cringe and say, okay, like what do you really mean, right? Presumably Mandarin. So, for the sake of just fidelity to the article, I'm going to stick with Chinese. But I just want to note my uncomfortableness with that part of it as well. So, Searle is provided with basically scripts, some Chinese scripts. So he doesn't understand it, right? He's given a few different scripts. He says, some of them are. He's given instructions in English about what to do when he sees certain symbols, right? So he's given basically different scripts, and he says some of these are turned out to be questions, right? People outside the room regard some of them as questions, some of them as answers. Really, all he gets is this set of rules about what he's supposed to do when certain things are fed into him in the room, right? They'll give him a sheet of paper or something with different symbols on it. He doesn't have any idea what any of the symbols mean. But based on his English instructions, he knows what to do when he's given certain symbols, right? He knows, okay, if you see this string of symbols, write that string of symbols on a different slip of paper and return it outside the room. Now, when he's talking about, through the paper, when he's talking about formal things and formal aspects, this is really what he's talking about. These instructions are formal because they only concern how to identify the Chinese characters by shape and things like that, how they look, not by the meaning of them, right? So he doesn't know what any of the symbols mean, right? He doesn't understand what any of it's about. He has no intentionality here. Rather, he's just, when he gets a certain input, he knows he's supposed to give a certain output based on his instructions in English, right? So he doesn't even really understand that his responses are answering these questions, right? Now, Searle, in addition, could be posed questions in English, and he can answer those in English. And he says it seems pretty obvious that he understands English, right? He's given the questions, he understands what they mean, he can respond to them without having to follow any particular kind of script. But he says, do I understand Chinese? If whenever I'm given, the inputs, I have to follow my formal rules given to me in English to provide the right kind of outputs, do I understand it, right? For the operations on the Chinese characters, he says that he performs computational operations on formally specified elements. For the purposes of the Chinese language, I'm simply an instantiation of a computer program, he says. Right? He says this could be a version of exactly what Schenck was doing with that computer program. Right? It could be that what he's getting are stories, right, in the input. And then he's answering questions about the story, even though he doesn't really know. All he's doing is following his own set of rules that he's been given, right? That's just what he knows. Now, he says in both cases, right, both when he's answering questions in English, right, just based on his own thinking and so on, as well as when he's answering questions in Chinese, he could pass the Turing test. That is, he could behave in such a way that somebody outside of the room would have no idea that the person inside the room does or doesn't understand the language, because his responses would be perfectly intelligible to the people who are asking the questions in English and getting those responses, as well as the people asking questions in Chinese and getting those responses. So he says from outside of the room, there's really no difference, right? As far as anybody outside the room is concerned, whoever's in there, or the room itself, depending on how we want to think about it, um, understands and is able to operate in the language, right? Whether it be English or Chinese. So does Searle understand Chinese? He thinks the answer is pretty obviously no. He doesn't understand Chinese, even if he can be formally instructed to operate and perform in certain ways to mimic the behavior of somebody who does. But mimicking or simulating that kind of behavior is not the same thing as duplicating or actually having the understanding, right? That's something different, right? And just like, you can think about somebody who's learning a different language, and you might learn based on certain prompts, right? Like learning greetings or something like this. You might learn how to say certain things, right? Certain, like a nice greeting. You might learn how to ask how to, I don't know, go to the bathroom, right? Where's the bathroom, or something like that. If you're trying to learn another language, right? You might learn how to order a coffee or something. But there is a difference between learning a certain linguistic or even, written form and actually understanding what it means, right? Because it's entirely possible you could learn a nice greeting, but not actually know what any of it means, right? You don't know what any of the parts mean. You don't know what the different words are. You don't know how they fit together. You don't know what rules govern the construction of the greeting, right? You just know, oh, when people see you, right, and they sort of wave, and if they say one of these things, say this other thing back to them, right? That'll make them happy. That's what they expect, right? You can do that. You can mimic that kind of behavior, but it doesn't mean you understand it. Whereas understanding means that you have this full appreciation. You understand the syntax as well as the semantics of what's going on. So this is the basic idea, and this is his counterexample, right? This is the big famous thing. Maybe even counter this in another class somehow. This is really what, thinking about Chappie, Searle would want to say, right? Chappie is, in some sense, like this Chinese room. There's a set of instructions on the inside that governs behavior based on inputs, right? It dictates certain sorts of outputs. But Chappie himself, right, doesn't really understand any of it. Just like Searle doesn't understand Chinese, even though he can mimic the behavior of somebody who does, Chappie doesn't understand. He doesn't think. He doesn't know. He doesn't feel. Right? He's not really conscious of what's going on in the world around him. He just responds to it in certain sorts of ways, right? Certain sorts of programmed ways. Might be very complicated program, right? Might be unpredictable. Might be adaptable. Might develop over time. Might adjust its responses and so on. But none of that means it actually thinks. Let's take a look at the replies and responses. So this is really Searle's argument, right? He wants to say strong AI is false based on the Chinese room thought experiment. And so he's, given this paper, given a presentation about it at several different, institutions, had lots of influential people asking questions and things. So he says, let's go through some of the replies to the Chinese room thought experiment and try to defend strong AI, right? Really defend the view that machines can think and say that the Chinese room thought experiment doesn't show us otherwise. So we'll go through those, replies to him, those objections to his own view, and then the responses he gives. So first, the systems reply. And this seems, and in the replies and responses, this is where Searle really talks about functionalism a little bit more directly. Systems reply, this is very much in line with what Putnam was saying with functionalism, right? That we really need to talk about the whole system, the whole input-output system. We don't talk about just a part of it, but it's really the whole thing that can feel pain or believe or think or whatever. So the individual in the room doesn't understand Chinese, but the room as a whole system does, right? Room or rooms, right? Because there could even be more than one. Response, right? If the person in the room memorizes the instructions, right, we eliminate the room as a system, but the person still fails to understand Chinese, right? So if Searle was in that room long enough, right, or you or I, and we really took the time, we could memorize all those instructions, that, okay, when I get these symbols in, I give those symbols out, right? Then we could really disregard the room, right? We could take the person out of the room, so to speak, right? And they could sort of functionally be speaking and engaging in Chinese, but they really still wouldn't understand it, right? They still have no sense of the semantics, is Searle's view. Also, Searle just thinks it's implausible that adding non-conscious items like bits of paper and pens and all that sort of thing somehow increase the conscious ability or understanding of the person in the room, right? To say that the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, but that the room as a whole with the bits of paper and the instructions and pencils and right, all that stuff, somehow adding that other stuff that itself doesn't think, right, to the person somehow makes them understand. So he thinks that's just sort of a funny view. Now, one may be tempted to posit subsystems in the person, right, an English one and a Chinese one, with different levels of proficiency. This is a development of this. But Searle thinks that doesn't really change anything because it would be the Chinese subsystem that matters, and it doesn't understand Chinese. At best, it understands the syntactical rules of what to do when faced with certain Chinese inputs, right? Now, the motivation to say that there's some part of Searle that understands Chinese seems to be simply the partisans of strong artificial intelligence in the first place, who want to say that anything that functions correctly, right, past the Turing test, that has the right kind of input-output functions, must be said to be thinking on some level. But Searle thinks that's just begging the question. That's just assuming the conclusion they want to be true in the first place, because Searle rejects passing the Turing test as actually being indicative of having consciousness in the first place. It's not just about behaviors, right? It's not just about the right input-output functions. Furthermore, concluding that Searle is cognizant, right, that he's aware of or conscious of Chinese based on his functioning in the Chinese room, right, the input-output relations, based on that, it seems like we're forced to say that all kinds of phenomena that aren't conscious are conscious based on their functions. This is where Searle talks about, the stomach, other organs. We could regard them as thinking in some way based on input-output functions, right? When they're stimulated in a certain way, they're in a certain kind of environment or something is happening, then they function a certain kind of way. But he says that we don't think they think, right? Stomachs and livers and light switches and thermostats, they don't think, right? Humans do. Do computers? No, because they're basically like really complex light switches, right? That's what they're most like. They're not like us. So Searle maintains that there's a real distinction between mental and non-mental phenomena. It isn't just whatever we want it to be. Hurricanes are not mental, human activity is. We cannot embrace a theory of consciousness that allows any mechanism whatsoever to qualify as being conscious. As he says, the study of the mind starts with such facts as that humans have beliefs, while thermostats, telephones, and adding machines don't. If you get a theory that denies this point, you have produced a counterexample to the theory, and the theory is false. So that's the systems reply, right, and his response to it. Next is the robot reply, right? A computer program on its own doesn't think, but if you place it in a robot like Chappie, right, that has the power of motion, right, can sense its environment and so on, then it does really think, right? So it's a matter of what's running the program, in sense of what's it capable of doing. Now, Searle's own response says that this tacitly concedes that cognition is not solely a matter of formal symbol manipulation, right? But it's just not clear how having additional functions would actually produce intentionality or any other mental states, right? So think about the Chinese room. We can take the same thing and then we can modify it so that it could move, right? Or Searle, might start pulling certain levers or doing other sorts of things in there. And unbeknownst to him, outside the room, there might be different results, right? He might be moving things around, or right, different lights might go off, or it could be moving arms around, or who knows what. Right? So the room itself could be modified so that outside of it, more things are happening. But that doesn't change the fact that Searle doesn't understand Chinese in the room. Right? So similarly for what we're talking about, if we think that a computer running a program can't think, then just because that computer is particularly sophisticated and hooked up to all kinds of other things like arms or legs or right, different things that can manipulate its environment, has speech processors and so on, none of that means that it's thinking, right? Those are all just different outputs it can have. Or if we had just like a normal desktop computer, we ran something like an AI program on it, and that AI program then could, through a microphone, it could detect audio input, and then it could also speak through the speakers, right? It had some sort of, part of the program that formulated words and it gave responses and everything. It'd talk to us, right? Hey, that sounds familiar, right? All these fairly new, the last 5-ish years, voice assistants and so on, right? You talk to it, it talks back to you, and they're getting better and better and better. But just because they're getting better and better and better incrementally doesn't mean that they're thinking. Even when they get to the stage that they're going, you can talk to them just like you could talk to somebody else, right? Your roommate or your, I don't know, sibling or whatever, right? That just means they've gotten really good at behaving in that certain sort of way. They've been programmed in the right sort of way. None of that means that they're actually thinking. So the third reply is the brain simulator reply. So here, what's going on is that we're making the computer or the machine that runs it much more sophisticated, so sophisticated that it actually simulates the brain functions of a human who can think and, say, actually understand Chinese. So in this case, it's a total simulation of all the brain functions. It's not just simulating the right input-output functions, but instead, right, it's like an artificial brain that triggers in the right sort of way, right? It gets the certain input functions, it fires, right, with all the right sorts of like fake neurons and everything, that the brain of a real human would do. Searle says, okay, you can take that route, but then it seems like you're actually giving up on the claims of strong AI, because the whole idea there is that you don't need something like a brain to actually understand and actually be thinking, right? Also, simulating the formal properties, right, just the right sorts of shapes, going through the right sorts of motions, is not sufficient, causally speaking, to produce intentional states and understanding, right? You could program it all in the right sort of way so that it goes through the right sorts of motions and then responds in the right sort of way, as the right sorts of outputs. That still doesn't mean it's actually thinking about anything or understanding anything in particular. So he says a bit more that I'm not going to go into, just about giving up on the claims of strong AI. Long story short, he says the whole claim of strong AI in the first place was that we don't need to know everything about how the brain works to understand how thinking works or to understand how the mind works. Right? The whole idea is that you can have a mind, you can have thinking without having to have a brain like ours, that some other sort of thing can do it. So fourth, the combination reply. Here we are sort of taking the first three replies and sticking them all together with a human-shaped robot with a brain-shaped computer in its head, and it duplicates human brain processes as well as human behaviors. Wouldn't that, as a whole system, be thinking? Right? Searle says, well, yeah, right. We would, in fact, ascribe consciousness to it. We would say it's conscious. We would regard it as a thinking thing if we didn't know anything more about it. Right? If we just ran across this in the street, sure, we would regard it as a thinking thing. We would think it was a conscious being. If you ran into Chappie walking down the street and saying stuff, you would regard him as thinking in some sense, especially if you talked to him and right, you engaged with him, and he seemed to engage fully in all this. There were no obvious limitations in what he can do in terms of being a thinking being and so on. But Searle thinks once we know, right, that the robot is really governed by a computer program, and that we can explain its behaviors by looking at that program and thinking about how that program functions and the inputs and outputs and so on, then in fact we would not regard it as being conscious anymore. So how does Searle justify this? Well, he says, look, thinking about the Turing test and the relationship between behavior and what we think is going on the inside of people, whether or not they're actually thinking and feeling and understanding and so on. He says, we infer what governs the behavior of other beings based on multiple things, including their behaviors and their biology, right? Including other animals and robots. Once we know that a computer program is controlling the behaviors of a robot, we have no grounds to infer that it is conscious, right? Because we have an alternative explanation. He says we can modify the Chinese room again. Right, the person inside now produces output strings of symbols that govern the robot's movement. But the person doesn't know that they're controlling the robot, say, right? Or which symbols produce which effects. If we knew that this was the case, right, we wouldn't conclude that the robot is conscious, right? If we knew that somebody inside the Chinese room was governing how the robot acts based on the outputs the person makes, based on the inputs they don't understand, plus the rules, right? We would think at that point that the robot wasn't conscious, right? And that thought experiment, he thinks, that design, right? Somebody inside the Chinese room experiment producing the outputs, which then in turn govern the robot, but they don't understand, right? They don't realize it does that, and they don't understand how it does that. He said that's basically what's going on in Chappie or any other kind of robot to start with, right? If we have a human-shaped robot with a brain-shaped computer, it's the same kind of thing that's happening, no matter how good the behavior's seen, right? No matter how well it mimics human behavior, and it can cry and laugh and joke, and right, it can do anything. Right? But that doesn't mean it's thinking. Right? Now, here again, Searle also thinks that this kind of reply, the combination reply, runs against the claims of strong AI. It really gives up on them, because it claims, the response claims, that instantiating a formal program with the right input and output is a sufficient condition of, is indeed constitutive of, intentionality. And this is really, if we think about just that, that was really Putnam's main claim in functionalism, that it's really the right kind of input-output relation that is really what intentionality, really what consciousness or thinking is ultimately, right? That's just what it is. There's nothing more to it, right? There's no, and when you think about how Putnam ended that piece, with what there really is, what's really out there, what questions are good questions, what questions aren't good questions. In some sense, what Searle is saying here is that there are good questions here. It's not just about input-output functions. It's not all just about the functions. It's not just about the behaviors. There's something more to thinking, more to consciousness than that. Putnam, at least in that piece, doesn't agree. Right? And so one thing, if you want to side with Searle, one thing that I think is certainly worth trying to make clear is, what is it? What more do we want than the functions, exactly? And this isn't to just sort of weigh things in Putnam's favor, but it's a good question, right? What are we missing if we try to stick with the functional level, right? If we're looking at the behaviors, the input-output functions, the state of the system, and so on. What is missing? Not only what is missing, but how do we know that other beings, such as other humans, have that missing thing, right? And why is it that we are better able or more justified in thinking or judging that other humans or other animals have whatever that missing thing is that something like a machine, like a computer or robot doesn't? Right? I think those are really the key and interesting questions. Okay, two more quick objections and replies here. So the other minds reply, and this part of what I was just saying, right? We only infer that other beings understand or are conscious on the basis of their behaviors. So we should attribute cognition to computers on the same grounds, if they can behave in the right sorts of ways. Right? Searle responds, and this confuses really epistemology for ontology. The question of what we know and what we're justified in believing, right? That's the epistemic side. With what there is, with ontology, with our theory of what the world is really about, right? Searle is making a claim about what exists, right? About whether or not machines are, right? Other machines or other humans or other animals are conscious or thinking or not, right? Whether or not they have certain things, about whether certain things exist, right? Thoughts in Chappie. Not a question of how we know whether or not there are thoughts in Chappie, or whether or not we know, or on what grounds we know that other humans or other animals have thoughts and so on. Right? So he really wants to say that we need to separate those things out. Now, of course, they're related in some sense, certainly, but just because we might not be able to easily distinguish from just based on, say, behavior, that right, like say we were interacting with, like the Turing test, right? Basically, the Turing test is that you've got one person, right, say me, and I'm communicating somehow with two other beings, right? One's a computer or a machine of some sort, one's a human. And the question is whether or not the machine can trick me into thinking it's human, right? That's really what it is. Can I accurately identify who's who, right? And sort out, oh, you're right, person A is the machine, person B is the human, right? Now, the Turing test is really this question about what I believe and on what grounds I believe it, right? But the fact that, even if I can't be sure which one is which, that doesn't mean that there isn't a fact of the matter about which one is which. Just like even if we have trouble based on, say, behaviors of figuring out, what's a machine and what's a human, right? That doesn't mean that suddenly machines are humans or vice versa. Okay, last one, 6, the many mansions reply. Eventually, we can create machines that will have the causal processes to produce intentionality. So we can create artificial intelligence that way, right? We could make biological machines. We could make computers and robots made out of lab-grown biological tissues, say, right? Or other sorts of materials, right? That really could produce intentionality. So we could create artificial intelligence that way by making the right sort of machine out of the right sorts of materials. This here again, Searle says, this is just redefining and really abandoning strong artificial intelligence's thesis that mental processes are computational processes over formally defined elements. That is, the whole strong AI hypothesis in the first place was supposed to be saying the materials don't matter. Intelligence is really a matter of having the right program or having the right computational process or set of processes over formally defined elements, having the right sort of form or shape or functions, not being made of the right stuff, right? With this, we're starting to get into matters of biology and questions of what causal processes will actually produce intentionality. As Searle says, what matters about brain operations is not the formal shadow cast by the sequence of synapses, but rather the actual properties of the sequences, right? A computer might simulate the formal shadow of the synapses firing, but that doesn't duplicate the actual properties of their firing. Just like simulating a hurricane or a fire or a snowstorm doesn't actually produce their same effects in the world around us. Right? Searle notes that the proponents of strong artificial intelligence have residues of behaviorism, functionalism, and dualism in their views. From behaviorism, they take up the view that what behaves as if it's thinking should be seen as actually thinking, right? Taking the Turing test. From dualism, they inherit the view taken up by functionalism that we can separate the mind and or mental states from the physical states that produce them, right? That is, we can have one sort of thing, mental, that may exist separately from its causes, which are physical. Searle rejects this view. Certain effects may only be produced by certain causes, and only things like human brains produce mental effects, right? It is an empirical question how far this goes, but our empirical evidence from simple machines indicates that they do not have any mental properties. And so even if we make more and more sophisticated machines based on that same basic hardware, right? At no point do you magically get consciousness, right? Just because Chappie is a very sophisticated program running on that machine, he's not conscious any more than any of the other droids are, any more than Dion's, when Dion's still working on the program early in the film, he has a lot of sort of simple little helper bots, right? That have much simpler programs and they go do things, right? They clean up his apartment, they get him drinks and whatever, right? Are those conscious? I think here that's an interesting way to put this. I don't think so, and I don't think Dion thinks so, because if he thought they were conscious, he wouldn't be so excited about artificial intelligence, right? His whole pitch about what artificial intelligence could do would just be sort of missing the point. He already has conscious helpers right there, right? So presumably he doesn't think they're really conscious. Why? I think, right, response, they're not sophisticated enough, right? What does that mean? They're just not as complex as what Chappie turns out to be. But if they aren't conscious, Searle would argue, Chappie can't be conscious either. He's just doing more than they do, not something different in kind. So that's it for Searle. That's it for our look here at machine consciousness. Can machines think? Is Chappie thinking? Is Chappie conscious? Does he think? Does he feel? Does he believe? Or does he just run a program, a sophisticated program, an interesting program, right? A program perhaps worth developing, but not one that would give robots anything like rights, not anything that would make them a person. And it's precisely that question of what it is that makes someone a person that we're going to be looking at in our last unit of the course. And for that, we're going to be looking at Chappie, thinking about, when Chappie and Dion switch bodies at the end of the film, do they continue being the same person through time? And there we might want to say Chappie was never a person, so we don't have to worry about it. Okay, what about Dion? When Dion transfers his consciousness, if that's what happens, right, but maybe not, because if robots can't think, robot Dion is not actually thinking. He's just mimicking the thinking that real Dion did in the first place. Right? But if, in fact, consciousness can be transferred that way, is robot Dion the same Dion as, dead biological Dion when he looks over, his old body? Or not. We're also going to take a look at Moon, kind of a trippy movie. So I mentioned Kevin Spacey's in it. Sam Rockwell is really the main character, in some ways the only character. In some ways, there's more than one character, but I'm going to stop. I want to stop right there because I don't want to spoil it too much. It's a very interesting movie. It's also pretty trippy, I think. And so we're going to look at that and think about this question: what does it make somebody the same person through time? As our final topic. So we'll be back talking about Chappie and Moon in regard to that topic tomorrow. We're looking at taking a look at John Locke's 17th century answer to this question: what does it make somebody the same person through time? On Thursday, and then next Monday we're going to be a last reading with Derek Parfit's 20th century answer to this question, which gets pretty complicated itself. So I hope you're doing well, and until tomorrow, this all fell apart again. Come on, why can't I come up with a good way to end the video? I'll just do this.